Good afternoon. I'm Susan Glasser, the editor of Foreign Policy, and I am delighted to welcome you to this special sneak preview of David Rothkopf's new book, Power, Inc., The Epic Rivalry Between Big Business and Government and the Reckoning That Lies Ahead. We couldn't be happier to see you all here on a rainy / almost snowy afternoon. So I want to thank you, first of all, for that. This should be a terrific sneak preview. As I said, the book does not come out till March 1st, so you're all the debut audience for this. And in fact, I'm going to use the debut title among David's many titles, and I think this is probably the first public event in which I can introduce him not only as my friend and colleague at Foreign Policy, where he's been writing a great blog for the last 3 years, but also as the CEO and editor at large of the magazine. And so we're delighted not only to welcome you here today, but also to welcome, I think it's the world's first case of a blogger turned CEO. So. But this is, his other title, and the reason that you're all here today, of course, is author as well. And this is not by any means David's first book, but the latest in a long string of great hits. And in recent years, he's written Superclass, The Global Power Elite and the World They Are Making, and Running the World, The Inside Story of the National Security Council and the Architects of American Power, which the New York Times called the definitive history of the National Security Council. And I'm sure when the reviews are written of Power, Inc., they will include similarly highfalutin accolades. For the meantime today, we'll hear directly from David on some of the themes of the book, which Anne-Marie Slaughter in her blurb for the book called, I believe, one of the best-timed books of the year. And I couldn't think of a subject that has more commanded headlines and that deserves the kind of literally centuries-long history that David has devoted to chronicling the tug-of-war between big business and big government, small business and small government, and all the variations in between. So what's going to happen today is we're going to hear from David about the book, and then we're going to have a panel discussion with a really all-star cast, moderated by Ed Luce from the Financial Times. So I'll leave it at that, and welcome you all here this afternoon. Thank you, and congratulations, David.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you for the double welcome for everybody, and also to FP, which I'm delighted to be part of. In addition to my work here at Carnegie and my work at Garton Rothkopf, it's a great opportunity. Also, thank you to this great panel for joining us. I'll thank them again at the end, but given the weather, I want to thank them and you vigorously. In Washington, one snowflake falls down. They immediately shut down the Fauquier County school system. The Montgomery people were calling me. My children are being, rushed from school because the streets are slightly moist. I think none of you are at risk for coming, however, and I'm delighted that you've come to join us. I'm going to talk just for 10 or 15 minutes about a few key themes of the book. Then we're going to get into this panel discussion, and then we're going to get into some questions and answers from each of you, which we hope you'll think about as you go, because obviously having a conversation among a group as august and good-looking and hearty as this group is also something that we would welcome. I'm going to sort of stay at the high level within my discussion of the book because we don't have a great deal of time. The subtitle of the book is The Epic Rivalry Between Big Business and Government and the Reckoning That Lies Ahead, and that pretty much tells you all you need to know. Well, I kid. I encourage you to buy the book and buy it for your friends and families, but that gives you the overarching theme of the book. What I'd like to do is offer a couple of perspectives you might not pick up on or assume are within the book, beginning with one of the most important that I've taken away from this, which is procrastination pays. Had this book come out on time, Mitt Romney wouldn't be making it a big story every day. You wouldn't be thinking 1% versus 99%, Occupy Wall Street, European capitalism in crisis, American capitalism in crisis. This is the current issue of The Economist, the rise of state capitalism, validating again this principle. None of that would have happened if I had listened to my wife, who's here, and actually finished this book when it was due. However, cannily, I recognized that if I only waited and watched one more sitcom, when this book came out, it would be timely. And that's what's happened here entirely by accident. The origin of the book, briefly, was that I had just finished this book called Superclass, which, by the way, had I procrastinated that a little longer, that would have done pretty well now, since it was about the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. But I just finished it, and one of the things that struck me in this book was about the most powerful people in the world, was that most of the ones that really were powerful because they were associated with big private organizations. And it was the rising power of those organizations and the way that that power had arisen in ways that defied what we are taught in graduate schools and undergraduate schools and the way that we think of the world. These players had gotten so big that it really amounted to a game changer in the way international relations took place. And I was kind of interested in why that had happened, what had fueled it, and where that might lead. Now, there was one other reason I wrote this book, which is substantive, and I see at least one other colleague of mine, Rob Shapiro from the Clinton administration. I know Nelson Cunningham, who was another colleague, is in the back here someplace. But in the Clinton administration, I was part of a group of people who were out there pounding the table for globalization. I was at the front lines of people saying free trade was the solution for everything. And we overdid it. We overstated it. We understated the dislocations that have been caused by this. We understated some of the knock-on effects that have actually caused some pain. That's not to say that trade liberalization isn't a good thing. It's a good thing. It's not to say that freer markets are better than more controlled markets. They clearly are. But we had gone too far. And one of the things I wanted to understand was, were there other models? Were there other models catching on? Were there other models working better than the model that we were pursuing? And indeed, there are lots of models. And in fact, that's one of the core conclusions of the book. Now, having said that, I'd like to sort of take the remaining sort of 5-10 minutes that I've got here and just focus serially, briefly on a couple of kind of myth-busting ideas that are within the book that are things that you may want to think about. The first of these is, what's news is not new. Okay? This book seems very timely because Susan Glasser told you it was timely, and in so doing, she was quoting Anne Marie Slaughter, and both of them are, in my experience, right about almost everything. But it's not a resonant story simply because it's a timely story. It's a resonant story because it's a 1,000-year-old story. And one of the things that the book does is it goes back to the origins of the struggle between public and private power. And that story goes back so far that you see it as the immediate successor, actually, to the prior epochal power struggle between church and state, which was a struggle between one approach to the distribution of power and economics and another. And in fact, produced the first big backlash against globalization, because one thing you might want to think about is that the Catholic Church was kind of the first big global organization, and the Reformation was a bunch of nation states saying, no, we want to take our power back within our borders. And so that represents something that kind of presages our time. And as you look through history, you find other things that presage the issues of our time, push back against political power being co-opted by private power, that echoes today's headlines almost exactly. If you go back to the South Sea Island bubble in the beginning of the 18th century in England, and you pick up some of the British newspapers, which read very much like the one that Ed works for now. You've changed some of the letters and things, but the reality is that the arguments that government had been co-opted by big corporate interests, that the people in the government owned shares in this big company that had gone bust, that they were bailing out the company to bail out themselves. These are exactly the same arguments we've had today. Some of the pushback against mega corporations came from places that you wouldn't expect it to come from. In fact, this leads to the second myth buster, which is that kind of what is history is fact. For example, I'll just give you a couple examples. There are a million of them, but some of the people that we are taught about as the architects of the world as we see it, John Locke and Adam Smith and people like that, they weren't exactly as we depict them, just like our modern day. There was no Ronald Reagan that's like the Ronald Reagan that we talk about. There was no John Kennedy that was like the John Kennedy that we talk about. Well, Adam Smith was against big mega corporations. And even though capitalists, mega capitalists, fundamentalist capitalists today say, yes, follow the book by Adam Smith, he railed against overconcentration of power in companies like the British East India Company. John Locke, one of the champions of our personal liberties, at the same time that he was championing personal liberty, was involved in regulating the slave trade and participating and profiting from the slave trade in the UK. You find throughout that self-interest guides in each one of these kinds of things. But you also see other things. Our view is that democracy began in Rome and Greece. And as you go back, and the origins of this book go back to the very first corporation that's still in existence today in the West, a company that's now called Stora Enso, but back in the day it was called Stora Kopparberg and was a copper mine in Sweden. But if you go back and you sort of dig around where this copper mine was digging around, you find that a lot of the original ideas of democracy and the way society ought to be organized that we have originated not in Southern Europe, but in Northern Europe. Just as I think a lot of ideas about the way the future of capitalism is going to develop will not be along the lines of the heavy-handed and irresponsible state-dominated capitalism of Southern Europe, but more along the lines of the kind of hybrid capitalism with a strong role for the state and a strong respect for the private sector that you see in Northern Europe or parts of Asia. There are a couple of other things that this tells us. One is corporations are new or mega corporations are new, and they're not, as I've just indicated. Another is, and this brings us into a current issue of the moment that corporations are people, and of course corporations are not people. Were not intended to be people. The first corporations were conceived to serve the state, to provide mechanisms by which states could trade and build up their treasuries. And it was only, particularly after the advent of the U.S. and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that you began to see them morphing. And this took place in a series of legal cases in the United States more than any place else. So the Dartmouth College case early in the 19th century, which said once a corporation was granted its rights, it could keep them going, broke the mold. The 14th Amendment, which was originally passed in order to ensure equal protection under the law for African Americans and others, was used more than half the time in its first several decades of existence to ensure that corporations had equal protection under the law, to the point that Justice Brandeis decried this, that this was not what was conceived. And that then has led us all the way to Citizens United, which is something that indeed we might talk about in the course of this discussion. Another of the myths here, and I'm going to wrap this up in a second, is sovereignty is best protected through the nation state. There have been lots of different kinds of sovereigns over time, and one of the things that we see today is that we enter a global era in which there are global threats, and it is becoming increasingly difficult for nation states to meet their obligations under the social contract, and therefore we face a conundrum. Do you stick with this system that can't actually protect people and provide them with what it said, or do you pass sovereignty upward? Is the only way to preserve sovereignty to share it among countries so that you can do things on a global level? There's another myth of the day, and this is again something that we might want to talk about here, which you might hear at a Ron Paul rally, but you hear it even in more mainstream settings where everybody's not wearing camo. And that is where governments are rolled back, where you push back on government power, inevitably liberty fills the void. That's nonsense. When you push back on government power, other entities with power fill the void. The most powerful entity fills the void. The reason that you have government is to provide people with a seat at the table. When you push government out of the equation, you push people away from the table. And markets, although there are democratic and beneficial elements to markets, don't translate into mechanisms by which the good of the public at large are advanced. They are mechanisms by which efficiency is promoted, which tends to accrue to entities that have scale. So markets serve those with scale better than they serve the average little guy, and often to the point that they don't create opportunity. You need balance. And that's the punchline of the book. The punchline of the book is that we are in a search for balance. And we thought at the end of the Cold War that we had gone from this kind of Manichaean world where you had on the one hand leave it to the state communism, and on the other hand leave it to the markets capitalism, and that what we saw was communism failed, capitalism won, American capitalism was going to set the path for everybody forward. Well, we had that victory dance 20 years too soon. Because as we have seen, American capitalism, particularly in the past decade, has proven itself to be not extremely good at revitalizing the economy, not extremely good at providing social mobility. It has, in fact, really only excelled at one thing, which is promoting inequality, which, while we haven't built bridges and we haven't created jobs, we have created ever-deepening inequality in the United States, while meanwhile, other models are gaining traction. And it's not just, this calls the rise of state capitalism. State capitalism is a very popular term these days. It is designed to oversimplify an argument so that you can't even have the discussion. Because state capitalism doesn't exist. There is no, China is what we're talking about here. That's code, right? And the Chinese problem in many places is that there is too little government control and you have chaos. Now, there are other places where there's too much government control and they're searching for the right balance. But they're not the only ones. Capitalism with Chinese characteristics is one type of capitalism, but you have small state entrepreneurial capitalism like you might find in Singapore, the UAE, or Israel. You've got democratic development capitalism, like you might find in big countries like Brazil or India. You've got 2 or 3 different kinds of Euro capitalism. You've got American capitalism. There are a lot of variants. And what we have got, instead of a world where you have American capitalism transcendent, is a world of competing capitalisms. And that's kind of the conclusion of this book, that we live in a world not of states solving the world's problems, but of states and super citizens, which are big companies that are the size of countries. And you can use any measure you want, whether it's GDP to sales, which is not a good one, or just simply, if you look at the top 15 companies that are out there, many of them have more international outposts than most large countries have embassies. Many of them have more employees than most large governments have employees. Many of them have profits that are bigger than the government budgets of some significant-sized governments. So you can't just sort of shrug them off and say, well, they're not players in this. You can't deal with global warming. You can't deal with global health issues. You can't deal with development issues. You can't deal with energy issues. You can't deal with job creation issues or migration issues unless you've got public-private mechanisms, and we don't have those. So you've got to deal with public-private mechanisms, super citizens and semi-states and real and big states in some new mix, and we are going to watch as the balance between these various players is solved within national governments and across national governments by this sort of competition among capitalisms that's unresolved. The only thing that we know about that competition is that what we end up with in the 21st century is not likely to look like what we have in the 20th century. And that the American leadership that we assumed was going to guide this process going forward is not necessarily going to guide this process going forward, because the economic center of gravity of the world is shifting, and throughout history as the economic center of gravity shifts, so does the intellectual center of gravity, and so other forms may take hold. And indeed, we may end up with a form of capitalism that's less Milton Friedman and more Lee Kuan Yew going forward. It's unresolved. And a lot of how it gets resolved is going to be impacted by some of the internal debates like we're having here in the United States. I know that those are the debates that Ed and the panel want to talk about, as well as the global ones, so let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for that. for that wonderful talk. Before I introduce the very well known to you already panelists, let me just briefly say I've read David's book twice now, first in galley form a few months ago and more recently in preparation for this event. And I don't think there's anybody else I know other than David who could start a book with a wonderful but obscure story about a Viking dog 1,000 years ago in Scandinavia.
What's a goat, actually?
A goat. Sorry, there is a dog that discovers the copper mine later on. I'm sorry, I got the dog and the goat confused. And then bring it to a supremely relevant book facing the quandary that faces economic policymakers all around the world today of different competing capitalisms and how to respond to this new, far more intellectually multipolar era that David describes. Also, I don't think I know anyone else than David, other than David, who could, in an otherwise very erudite discussion about population, could work in reference to that well-known modeler, William Fuck, which I must say that I can't think of a more apposite name for a demographer than that. So with that, let me just very briefly introduce the panelists. And I'm allowed to say that because it's his name.
I'm checking. I'm checking the index.
C-SPAN do not have a policy about proper names. Bob Hormats is very well known to all of you, as indeed is Dan. Bob, as you know, is the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. He's worked in the past for many administrations, in quite the distant past, previous administrations, the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, and now this administration, where you're recognized as one of the...
It's amazing that you can get around under your own power.
That's true, I know.
It is.
I do my best. For you, I can...
And now, and in the intervening period, of course, was a very senior and well-known Goldman Sachs executive. And Dan, of course, is the author of many magisterial works on the global energy market and the global energy economy. Commanding Heights, I think, is a particularly relevant one to this discussion, but of course there's The Quest, his recent book about the rapid changes the global energy market's undergoing. So neither need any introduction. Bob, could I start with you? Now, David describes this era of competing capitalisms, a kind of ultimate meta-capitalist competition, a competition between capitalist models. First of all, do you agree with his thesis that that's the era we're in? And secondly, do you agree with what he argues very persuasively in his book and is referred to in his talk, that the Anglo-Saxon version, the American version, which to caricature government should get out of the way, markets are always efficient, etc., is the one that is most under challenge right now and the one most in need of taking lessons from the others? Would you take those two questions?
Well, let me take the first part and then move on to the second. I think we're very much in the midst of this era of competing capitalisms. And let me just go through, David described quite eloquently the various kinds of capitalisms that are competing. You have, and let me just take it a couple of steps further. One, you have state capitalism, which David spoke of and which The Economist has written about. Then you have, as we've seen, what was known as crony capitalism, which we've seen in various parts of the world. Then you have what I'd call entrepreneurial capitalism, which is the sort of Silicon Valley kind of capitalism. Having spent a fair amount of time there, you have that. Then you have small business capitalism, which David spoke of, which we're seeing in a number of countries. And then you could have chaotic capitalism, which essentially is capitalism without rules or without effective rules. And you have that in various parts, as he pointed out, in China. And the interesting thing is that you can look at these with two slices. One, that different countries embrace these different systems. But you can also look at it the way that David hinted at, and that is that many of these capitalisms compete within a single country. And in China, you have state capitalism in parts of China. You have entrepreneurial capitalism in parts of China. You have chaotic capitalism in parts of China, where people build things without very much supervision. So it is a very complicated environment in which capitalism competes among countries and various kinds of capitalism compete within countries. Then you get to the second part of your question, and that is American capitalism under siege? I would say that, and can we learn from others? I would say that entrepreneurial capitalism, as it's practiced in the United States, is in full bloom and very effective. If you go to parts of this country, you see among the most entrepreneurial people in the world with new ideas and with new products, and we are a very innovative country. You also see parts of our system that are very much in need of the infusion of new ideas and new ways of doing things. And in particular, I would just identify three elements that I think are needed to give American capitalism, or the various aspects of capitalism here, a big boost. One is the critical element of American capitalism for decades and decades, back to the early days of this country, was vibrant immigration. The best and the brightest were attracted from all over the world. Our capitalism was not just the capitalism of building things. It was the capitalism of creating new ideas and importing people who generated new ideas. For instance, we're at the Carnegie Foundation. Andrew Carnegie. If you go to Silicon Valley, Andy Grove, the idea that we are a nation in which capitalism was the result of an environment in which people were able to thrive, and it attracted people from all over the world. The second is the critical element of upward mobility. This is something that is vitally important because it's not just sufficient to attract people from all over the world and to allow corporations to operate successfully. It's that upward mobility has been very important. I mean, my grandparents came from Eastern Europe, and Rob Shapiro and I grew up a block away from one another in Baltimore. Almost all the families had grandparents or great-grandparents who came from roughly the same area. The notion of upward mobility was critical, that parents thought if they put their kids to school and they got a good education, they would do very well. That is a critical part. That was the genius of Abraham Lincoln, and I go back to that and to Franklin, more or less the same thing. Lincoln understood, and he talked about it, which will lead to the third point, that the curse of slavery was the curse that it deprived not just white people, but African Americans of the opportunity for upward mobility. African Americans because they were slaves, white people because they had other people do their work for them, and therefore it deprived them of this notion of getting ahead because they didn't have to. It was too easy. Life was too easy. It was a curse for the slave and the slaveholder. Lincoln talked about this a lot. The third point is infrastructure. Infrastructure is very important to making capitalism work today. And so if you ask me, what can we learn from other countries, is that you need to have a system which continues to attract, as Singapore is doing, people from all over the world come there to do biotechnology, nanotechnology, a whole range of things. We need to keep ourselves open to new ideas and new people. Second, we need an educational system that focuses on the kinds of jobs that are needed, but also enables people, particularly lower income people, to enjoy that upward mobility. Critical to capitalism is the ability to advance and the ability to see the system as enabling you to advance. And the third is infrastructure. Infrastructure is critical, not just roads and ports, but information infrastructure, because the great power, the great driving force of capitalism today is the democratization of information and the democratization of the systems that enable information to flow back and forth. And if you don't, it's been the case, Jefferson said this, that you need to have a democratic system and you need freedom of the press. You need freedom of information today. It's critical to the democratic process. So I would say we need to learn from other countries who are doing those things very well, that we need to do them a lot better, to rise to the competition rather than fall back from it.
Thanks. I will come back to you before we go to the audience. Dan, your book, Commanding Heights, seems to be more relevant for this discussion because you described in great detail the shift from state-controlled world to a more market-driven world, and you caught that moment brilliantly. Given that today 10 or 12 years later, we're living in a world where, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, 8 or 9 of the world's top 10 oil companies are state-owned. Brazil, Russia, China, India. Is that paradigm already coming under challenge?
I think, well, first let me congratulate David on his procrastination. As a result of that, your book is really well timed and will be a great contribution to the discussion. It has, when you read it, you'll see it as a wonderful sweep of history. And it clearly is about, and it's going back to what you're talking about, a global shift in power, and economic power and political power that's unfolding before our eyes. And one of the themes of Commanding Heights was that this frontier between government and markets is always shifting. It's never fixed, and I think that's one of the arguments of your book. Clearly, Commanding Heights was a moment which you described yourself. I was looking at it on page 18, which was, the post-Cold War moving towards global markets, globalization, and competition, and seeing that swing. But I remember at the end writing that, this is a pendulum, and if economies don't perform well, if there's loss of opportunity, if there isn't a sense of equality, at least equality of opportunity, if it doesn't deliver in terms of GDP, you're going to see a swing back. I think that's happening combined with the second thing, which is globalization, and which is also really what explains, these different things. I was thinking as David was talking, if we'd had this conversation, back when Japan was going to be number one, then we would have been talking about other capitalisms. We would have been talking about Rhenish capitalism. For those who don't know what that means, that meant Rhine, as in Germany, German capitalism, or French capitalism, or Japanese capitalism. Now we're talking, as you say, about Brazilian capitalism, and I think, as you sort of said, The Economist, a lot of it is really about China and Chinese state companies. But I think what I would say, and I think it has shifted back, but I think it's going to continue to be an evolution. Two things to say. One is, I think you did have a caricature of American capitalism. I mean, for whether it may not be very well done, there may be mistakes, but we actually, like Europe, are pretty highly regulated society, and our economy is actually pretty highly regulated. Maybe not well regulated, but it is. The other thing is, in the Quest, I have this little scene with the CEO-to-be of PetroChina's Chinese National Petroleum Company, and asking him, why are you going to the trouble to do an IPO? Isn't it enough problems that you have to report to the Politburo? Do you also need to report to fund managers in Singapore and New York? And he says, we have to benchmark ourselves against the world economy. And I suspect that, could be wrong, that we will see an evolution that these companies, the discipline of the world economy, will change these companies as times go on, because they're very much caught up in a transition. And I think, just as a final point, you look at Europe, it was too much government. It was supporting welfare systems that the society couldn't support. And if anything, they have to sort of back away from that more towards markets. So, I mean, there's kind of more than one thing going on in the world at the same time.
I'd certainly agree with that as a description of Greece, but not of Germany.
No, but the other countries had the German illusion that they too could be Germany without generating the wealth of Germany.
Well, that segues perfectly onto the question I wanted to ask David, which is, you describe the corporation in America as having benefited more than human beings from individual rights, or amendments designed for individual rights, like the First Amendment. We have Citizens United, the right to free speech, corporations as people, and the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Amendment as well, which was the amendment that ended slavery. And contrast that in your book with how corporations are treated in other countries, namely places like Germany and Singapore, where there's more of a mutual social contract in the licenses they're given. And what I wanted to ask you is, assuming, as you argue, that the world is looking more closely at that latter model and the merits of that latter model nowadays, are you worried that this reckoning you're predicting for the American model, the Anglo-Saxon model, this debate that needs to be had, will be postponed, will be put off, will be forgotten about, given the crisis we've got in Europe at the moment, given this slow-burning but very dangerous crisis Europe is going through?
No, I'm not. I think Bob and Dan have both described a process that's constantly ongoing, and the global marketplace that, in some respects, we're all describing as a marketplace of ideas, where different versions of different approaches to different things are being discussed all the time. How do you regulate global financial markets? How do you deal with climate as an issue? How do you deal with providing a social safety net and so forth? And when things work in one place, people look to them and say, yeah, well, there'll be more of that. I think the United States is at risk right now because, clearly if inequality is growing and social mobility is constrained and we're not creating enough jobs and there's a perception that some people in society have an unfair influence over the outcomes in society, and things like Citizens United and the creation of super PACs and the ability of a few people to write big multi-million-dollar checks and change political outcomes. I think if that's the perception, that's not going to gain traction elsewhere, and people will look for alternatives. And frankly, I think a lot of the best alternatives still are in Europe. I think Dan just said a minute ago at a different point we would have talked about German capitalism or French capitalism, and frankly, I recall a conversation during the Clinton administration with a senior official then, very senior official, who said, Europe is a museum. It's all about the past, and they haven't created a net new job in any time. Shortly thereafter, we stopped creating jobs, and some parts in Europe have done a pretty good job creating jobs. And actually, if you ask the question, why do we have a society? Why do we create an economy? It's not just to create wealth for a few people. It's not just to grow GDP for GDP's sake. It's to provide a good quality of life. And people rank quality of life. And some of the countries with the highest quality of life indicators are in Northern Europe, and not just big countries, but small countries in Scandinavia and elsewhere. And those countries have active capitalism, and they've got strong social safety nets. And there are paradoxes there. For example, in Scandinavia, in Sweden, I spoke to, when I was writing the book, the Swedish former finance minister. Actually, Rob Shapiro set up the conversation. And I went and I talked to the guy, and he was talking about why Swedes embrace globalization more than Americans. And, which you would think, well, we're free markets and they're more socialist in their orientation. Well, it's because there's a safety net. And so they weren't afraid of dislocations in the way that we were. Or you talk about capitalism, the Swedes let Saab fail. We didn't let GM fail. Why could the Swedes let Saab fail? That seems very, creative destructionist. That's capitalism, Schumpeter. But the reason they did it, there was a social safety net. The people who worked in the company knew that they would be retrained and moved on to something else. So which is more capitalistic? Finally, while some people in the United States, say we don't want a European model, and I think, frankly, if you've got higher quality of life and you've got a better balance between market forces and government forces, you might want to look at it. A lot of those economies also rank at the very top of the list in terms of fiscal responsibility. So effective government doesn't mean big or wasteful government. And so, in Singapore and Israel and the UAE, you've got small models where they're involved in trying to help themselves be more competitive. They have a slightly different view. And I spoke to the Singaporean finance minister, and he said, our job in the government is to empower our people to succeed in the marketplace. And there are certain things governments can do: infrastructure, education, creating the kind of system that enables them to succeed. But they say, look, government's got a role. Meanwhile, we're having a discussion where half the people are saying government out is good. It's Orwellian. It's 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. And when you get to that kind of simplistic approach, you're almost inevitably wrong.
Two questions, Bob, follow-up questions. One is whether you agree with that. And
Yes.
Two is...
Don't step on that.
Yeah,
Just
no,
say yes.
I won't.
A yes or no answer will do.
That's right. Two is notwithstanding the fact that on merit and given your experience, you'd be deservedly a senior member of any administration, particularly on your thoughts on these kinds of topics.
When, as you noted, he has actually been a senior member of virtually every administration.
Yeah, all right. So that's correct. But given your resume, and given the fact that there is a very strong point at the heart of David's book, that the history is the last 1,000 years of history has really been a competing sort of tug of war between the public and the private, between state and companies. Do you think, and we had this morning a fascinating number, that more than half the money given, the $200 million or so dollars given to super PACs and spent by super PACs in the last 6 months, has been from 200 individuals? That kind of sway over democratic elections is extraordinary. Given that, and given that you are, like many members of this administration, a former senior executive on Wall Street, do you think David has a point about the retreat of public power and the growth of private corporate power? And I'm not, for any sense, in any way, implicating you in a revolving door, tawdry, K Street. You're there on merit. But it does qualify you. It does qualify you to answer the question.
Well, let me answer the first, because part of the answer to the first sort of segues into the second. I think there are, having observed other governments and the way societies operate, I would say that the role of government, there are many areas in which the government plays a role, and there are various regulatory aspects of government power, but there are two that David mentioned and underscored, which I want to elaborate on, because I think he's really identified critical elements of what makes a system work and what role the government plays in making a system work. There are two. One is fairness, and the other is security. And let me elaborate a little bit on both of those. I think that capitalism will not thrive. It may work, but it won't thrive if there is a perception of unfairness in the system. If there's a perception that the benefits of capitalism are accruing to a very small number of people, whereas a very large number of people find themselves disadvantaged by it. I think no system will survive, capitalism or no capitalism. But certainly that notion of fairness is critically important. And therefore, and one example of this is the Depression. In the Depression, why did we not have massive riots during the Depression? I mean, there were demonstrations here and there, but by and large, the Depression was not a period of enormous instability in this country of the kind you saw in the Bolshevik Revolution and the revolutions of 1848, other kinds of things. And it was the general view of Americans that while there were a few rich people, that by and large, a lot of people were suffering together. And for a large portion of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when corporations did well, people who worked for them did well. Productivity went up, wages went up. When you got a gap between productivity going up and wages not going up, in other words, some people doing very well, benefiting from that increase in productivity, but a lot of workers not feeling that they were benefiting and feeling that somehow the system was stacked against them, that tends to create this notion of unfairness. And you can see this today in the attitudes of people by most polls. There's a feeling that somehow the system is not working for the average person. Globalization is part of it. There's a view that globalization has caused this imbalance, but it's much more the result of technology leading to big improvements in productivity and large numbers of people not sharing those benefits. If you look at the median wage in this country, it's been relatively flat. So you need fairness, and there's a perception in some countries that the system is fair, that in Scandinavia you don't have the same gaps that you have in the United States, and you don't have this notion that somehow the system is stacked against the worker. And in parts of this country, that feeling runs very deep, and you can see it. The other point is the security issue. And this goes to another element of what David was saying. And the best illustration of that is Franklin Roosevelt. In his monumental book on the Depression, America at War and in Depression, the Stanford historian David Kennedy wrote about the early part of the Roosevelt administration. And what did Roosevelt do? He did not come in saying that he was going to cure the Depression. He never said that. He never said he would restore America to rapid growth. What did he say? If you look at his programs, they were about giving people a sense of security about the future, social security, security of your bank account, the Securities and Exchange Commission. He was, and NRA and other things, to give you a minimal job, a job where you can have the sense of dignity when you went to work every day. This was not an attempt to cure the Depression overnight. The Depression wasn't cured for a decade later. But he gave people the sense of security. I think that one of the things government needs to do, particularly in a very volatile period of time, is address the lack of sense of security that communities have, that people have, and countries that do that better, in a way, tend to be more experimental because the cost of failure isn't as high because there's a security blanket or a safety net to fall back on. Now, the point about the business community and the issues of the business community getting a large portion of the pie, I think that was really the question you were getting at. I think one of the things that is important in the business community, and I think you're seeing more and more of this, is that profits are obviously an important part of business, but it's very important also to have a moral compass and to understand that this system will not flourish over the long run unless a very large number of people in our society see that the economy is working in their benefit and is not skewed to the benefit of a very small group of people. And more, I'm finding this because I have in my area responsibility for sort of economics and energy, plus largely due to Anne Marie and the work she did on what was known as the QDDR. I have environmental issues under my jurisdiction. So
you noticed Anne Marie Slaughter reorganized
state. Anne Marie. She reorganized
and then left.
But then she came back for this event.
Right.
So a shout out to Anne Marie.
Yeah, right.
But the one thing that I'm seeing more and more of is that the business community understands that it needs to play a growing role in dealing with some of the social issues of our time, environmental issues being one. So I think that the business community has come to understand, for the most part, that playing a much more responsible and energetic social role is important, not just to their reputation, but if you're going to have a society in which people thrive and feel that the system is serving their interests, then the business community has to be more than just about profits. It has to be about inclusive growth. It has to be about greater emphasis on training, and it has to be about addressing a lot of these social issues. And I think this change is beginning to occur, and in some cases has, if you look at a number, I won't mention companies, but there are a lot of American companies that really now have come to understand that they play a social role in this economy as well as an economic one.
I thought that was a very thoughtful answer, and that you my more mischievous sub-question about the revolving door you skirted very informatively.
Well, no, and I think, let me just answer it. I think the revolving door, we've had this for
a long time.
A long time. But I do think that it's very important that when people get out of government, having seen government and then work in the private sector, sort of understand better what role, how the government can better how private sector can better cooperate with government. And I think having been in the private sector and then coming into government, you're in a way better able to work with or relate to the private sector than you might be if you'd spent your whole life in government.
Fair enough.
Dan, for the most part.
Yeah, for the most. Dan, global warming, to slightly change the topic, is obviously happening, or most people think it's obviously happening to some degree or another. They have a very weak grasp of the science, but they tend to listen to the scientists. What sort of challenge does this pose to your view or what sort of questions does this pose about the relationship between the public and the private in the global energy sector going forward?
Can you be a little more precise in the
Not use the phrase "going forward"?
Well, yeah.
I usually ban that phrase. It's clearly a public challenge,
yes,
and it's a global challenge par excellence. There's nothing like it. What, in terms of public response, state action, and in terms of the state's relationship with the big private energy companies that we have in the OECD, what sort of response do you believe is required, assuming, as I know, that you do believe a bigger response is required?
Well, I think, I mean, what you do see, there are two things. If you take the OECD, you see that there's a big shift towards natural gas going on, and that is about half the carbon content of coal. And for various reasons, it's unfolding in the United States. Brussels is less attuned to it. Brussels thinks you can just skip to offshore wind, but it's not it's still a very infant industry. I think the larger challenge is if you say, the United States has reached peak oil demand, our oil demand is going to go down. The issue is the countries that David is writing about where the balance of power is shifting. And you mentioned it, it's the Chinas, the Indias, which you can see them kind of in policy and rhetoric shifting what they say about climate change, very different than 4 years ago. But on the other hand, it still seems that poverty and economic growth is a bigger issue for them. And so if you see a world in which, at least where we are now, energy demand is going to grow by maybe 35% over the next couple of decades, all that growth is going to be in those countries. And so China, one official talked to in China said those strong winds, fierce winds in the northwest, he said we used to see them as a natural disaster. Now we see them as a precious resource. But when you look at their energy balance, you see their coal use is going to continue to go up as well. So it's a question for the OECD, but it's also very much a question for the new powers that David is really so much as the focus of his book.
Dave, before I turn it over to the audience, a final question to David. Your book is clearly a very powerful case for history and context, and understanding where we are today and the choices the world faces today. And you have this wonderful phrase in there, temporal narcissism, this idea in this Twitter age that what we're going through now is more important than anything else. So my question to you, and in the context of your previous answer about Europe and about the urgent driving out the merely important in our headlines every day, is whether a thoughtful, very well calibrated and supremely relevant book like yours, how it can get through in a Twitter culture. I mean, you can't sort of, even with temporarily successive tweets, easily summarize your book in sort of 140 words. How are you going to get people to focus on the much bigger conversation that you very persuasively urge they should be having, here in America particularly?
Well, I would tweet, thoughtful, very relevant, timely book, says Ed Luce of the Financial Times.
Your following would promptly plummet. You'd lose half your followers.
Two things. I think the other thing David hasn't announced yet, but his superclass book, he's going to reissue it and call it the 1%. I mean, that will be very helpful. But I think
That's a good tweet.
But there is. But before we open to questions, I think as I was sitting here, I was thinking we talk about corporations, and that is that question about corporations that go all the way back to that goat in Sweden. But what is a corporation today? Well, it's jobs for workers. It's also jobs and for management. It delivers goods and services. But there's one other thing that kind of gets forgotten. It's also for kind of everybody in this room. It's your retirements. I mean, where is the bulk of your retirement savings going to be invested and going to be delivered? So there's a lot of different things going on when we talk about corporations, and when you look at the demographics of our country, that actually becomes a bigger question.
Do you want to just tee up
No,
that?
Look, how can you argue with that? That's a very benign description of corporations, and it's certainly all things that are true about corporations. I think what we need to be more aware of, particularly in this kind of Twitter age where everything gets down to state capitalism versus leave it to the markets, or big government good or small government bad, is that these are very complicated things. There are wasteful governments out there that are overreaching. There are also governments that are doing it better that we ought to be paying attention to. Most corporate, there's a lot of talk. We hear, well, corporate social responsibility. Well, the average corporation spends something like a fraction, like a 100th of 1% or it's a tenth of 1% of their budget on things related to corporate social responsibility. Why? Because that's not their job. Corporations are big actors that are empowered by the law to focus on shareholder returns. That's fine, but you have leave those powerful forces, and you've got probably 2,000 corporations in the world that are bigger than the 50 or 70 smallest countries in the world. You can't just sort of leave them out there and say, well, they do some benign things, so we'll let them take care of these other benign things. They can handle global warming. Exxon has emissions equivalent to Taiwan. It produces oil and gas equivalent to the EU. It's a kind of player that you've got to reckon with in this thing, and you can't count on the kindness of strangers. And a lot of the policies of the Clinton administration that I remember were kind of like, well, look, if we get out of the way, Wall Street's full of these nice guys, and they're really, what'll happen is
they'll create some great financial products.
They'll create some great financial products, and actually these products, Alan Greenspan, they will reduce risk. All these derivatives, they will reduce risk. Do we understand them? Do we know who owns them? Do we know who's the potential consequences of collapse? No, but we trust them. Okay, and I think recently we've discovered you can't trust. You've got to verify, to take an old capitalist sage. You've got to balance these things out, and we need new mechanisms to balance them out. And Anne-Marie has walked in here, cannily at the end, missing all the boring stuff at the beginning, and sat in the front row.
You should mention Anne-Marie does have a last name.
No, I know, and I was about to do better than that. And has sat in the front row, which is very canny. But Anne-Marie Slaughter has written a book called New World Order, which talks about we need new mechanisms. We need new institutions. The old states, which are trapped within borders, the companies which are designed for the global era and are much more adept at dealing with global challenges than countries, exist in a world in which there are a whole set of transnational issues that neither is equipped to handle and both have got to work on together. Meanwhile, we've got these international institutions which were designed after the Second World War to be weak. They were designed to fail. And as we've seen in the past week with things like the Syria vote, they were badly designed to deal with some of the issues that we've got. And so what we're really confronted with here is a watershed moment where corporations have evolved to a point that our theories don't contain them, and where if they pursue their interests unfettered, that's going to cause some problems. Where some countries have shrunk. They don't produce their own money. They can't control their borders. They can't project force. They can't even enforce their own laws because companies can go and move someplace else where there are better laws that they like. Those countries, maybe 100, 150 countries, are now just semi-states. You've got a few big states and a lot of big countries and a bunch of dysfunctional institutions, and somehow we've got to remake that. Now, that's, hope, we can be hopeful about that. But what we also have to recognize is that you look back in history, when you have moments where the institutions and the rules don't line up with the forces and the players, you get disruption, you get chaotic circumstances. And we have to be aware that we are living in a time where the risk of that is higher than it is until we start remaking things in a way that's suited to the system.
I would just add one thought to that. I think that's absolutely right. The global governance system was not made for this era of dense, far-flung interconnections. And one of the things that's interesting as a player on the global scene now are NGOs. I think that's really interesting when you go. I was at a conference in Silicon Valley where you have widely distributed capability of people to monitor the environment, to monitor the wildlife, to monitor a wide range, water quality, to monitor working conditions all around the world. And it's this widely distributed micro expertise that is watching the role of government and is interconnecting on a level never before. And it does seem to me that while NGOs are not the answer to countering some of these concerns that you mentioned, they add a new voice. And what's more important, they add a whole new dimension of information that's available about what corporations and what governments are doing. So you really have, in a way, a third force out there. The press used to play that role, and the press still does to a degree, but added to the press are sort of the people's communication. Everyone has a voice on the internet.
But the difference with NGOs, though, and it's worth, the Gates Foundation puts as much money in the field as the World Health Organization does on certain healthcare issues, so it's a big player. But it's not accountable to any polity.
No, but it's a provider of information.
Right. So, but the point is, we can't defer too much to NGOs because we do want the people resolving these issues to be accountable to the people at large and not just rich guys who can set up foundations.
I was actually
But
not
other kind of NGO. I mean, that applies to the whole range of NGOs.
I know.
Right.
But I'm not suggesting we defer to them. I'm suggesting that they're in a much better position to hold governments and businesses more accountable than they otherwise would be.
I just got to take issue with one thing. When you said it was a benign interpretation about corporations, I don't think it's benign. I think there are people in this room who had 401ks that became 201ks. I mean, that's a very important role of companies.
No, everything you said was true. I just think it was selective interpretation.
I think this is a wonderful moment, with talk of the moral compass, temporal narcissism, be kinder to companies, whatever.
Not be kind, it's the roles they play.
Or indeed population experts with funny names, which I won't repeat, to open this up to the audience for questions. And do we have a microphone? Wonderful. Please show your hand, stand up, take the mic, and declare yourself.
There seems to be somebody there in the middle.
There is a hand midway up on the right.
There's one right here in the front, in the third row.
So shall I? I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a physician. I'm an attorney. I graduated from college in 1969 when capitalism seemed a little bit different. I was wondering, since this is about different capitalism models, if you could comment on the allocation of capital in this country. It seems like, if you think of Bain Capital, not in its venture capital capacity, but in its private equity capacity, it's taking money out of companies. It leverages them up. It uses the money to pay off someone else, and then it tries to make the company more efficient. And if that money that it took out went to finance something more productive, that would be great. But it seems like the financialization of the economy has led to more bubbles and speculative ventures and
where the money went primarily, it went to the California teachers and the Ohio state workers. I mean, because those were the investors. I'm not to defend Bain or any of these other funds, but that's who their main investors were.
Well, there are other ways to save money for retirement. My late husband was the chairman of the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation in the Clinton administration, Marty Slate. Thank you.
Could I ask all of you to comment? I mean, you've had a quick comment, but you can come back if you like, starting with David.
I think
the financialization
but I think who controls capital is an important issue because it really drives the direction of society. I don't have any objection to private equity companies going out there. I think they help some things grow and they promote the creation of jobs often. They sometimes are a little callous about dislocation, but I don't know that that's their responsibility. I think if we had a system that took care of people better in terms of dislocations, that would encourage that kind of entrepreneurship, and that's what exists in other places. But having said that, we have seen an enormous concentration of capital in the hands of very few people, an enormous concentration of wealth in the hands of very few people. And so, the top several hundred people in the United States control more wealth than the bottom half of the population. And, that's... again, I'm all for creating incentives to society, even large incentives within a society. But when you get to that point, you're creating disproportionate distribution of power. Those people have the ability to write checks to those super PACs. Those people have the ability to influence who goes in and out of office. Those people have the ability to determine which companies succeed or fail to a greater extent than other people. And so I do think there are legitimate questions raised about how the profits in some of those investments are taxed and how that money gets distributed in society, how people are compensated in those companies, and how we regulate that in society. And I think we've come to a moment where those questions should be coming up. But I think it says something about the nature of our system and the imbalances within the system right now that we're not actually having a serious conversation about that. In the wake of the crisis, we didn't have actually serious reform in the areas of certain of the areas of risks that you would have you thought you had seen them, and we are not having serious discussion about some of these issues about fairness. We have broad stroke discussions, but not serious move towards reform. And part of that's due to the other end of town here and the complete stasis of thought and action that is Capitol Hill.
I would either Bob or Dan like briefly to pitch in on that one? No. Questions? Or question? There's somebody right at the back who I can only see a hand, but yes. No, I'll get to you later.
Hi there, my name is Rachel Odell, and I just had a question to, in looking at kind of what are some of the problems of modern capitalism and these different competing capitalisms, you identified some of these capitalisms are better at providing things like a social safety net, at mitigating inequality. But, there's also kind of this understanding that capitalism doesn't provide for kind of deeper human needs, and that, it promotes this culture of materialism and consumerism. And is among these competing capitalisms, do any of them, seek to find ways to kind of return like a better local sense of community, or local ecology, or some of those sorts of values better than other systems of capitalism? Or are these kind of broader issues? I mean, you look back to sort of the Buddhist economics that that have been advocated in the past in the 70s, and kind of the localism movements. Is there any way to kind of work that into our modern capitalist systems and address some of those human psychological needs?
Well, I think the short answer is democracy. I think economic systems alone don't solve the problem. You need a balance between economic and political systems, and you need political systems that function effectively on behalf of people at large and identify priorities and the direction of the assets of a country to those priorities. Places where democracy isn't functioning very well are places where, by nature, markets can't do the most for society. And so, again, it comes back full circle to this notion that you need balance and effective forms of governance to set social priorities, because I agree absolutely that markets alone will not set priorities that serve society as a whole. They don't have consciences. They don't have vision. They tend to serve scale, and they tend to serve people who have more than people who don't have. So, we need to find out balancing mechanisms.
I would just add one thought, and that is, I think that the balance part that David's talking about and has written about is really a critical element. And when things get out of kilter, or when the system is perceived as unfair by a very large number of people, there are remedies, and we've gone through this in the past throughout our history, to rebalancing and still maintaining very vigorous capitalism. So it's really not either or, it's the environment, it's the framework within which capitalism operates that is the key element. You can have very vigorous capitalism where there are balances in the system that avoid these large imbalances in terms of opportunity or wealth without undermining the capitalist system. The Citizens United issue, which David talked about, troubles me a bit in the sense that it creates the impression, the court decision and what's happened afterwards, creates a decision that a great deal of wealth, in effect, enables you to exert a great deal of political power because of the way the decision was written and the amount of money that has followed to very concentrated sources. I have no objection to people exercising their freedom to make contributions or their freedom of speech, but they're not exactly the same. And therefore, it does seem to me that part of the notion of a system that is balanced is a system in which there is not a great deal of concentration of wealth that is brought to bear in the political process, and there is a great deal more equity in the distribution of the contributions to candidates and to the political process, because it gives people a feeling that there is a greater opportunity for them to have a voice if they, as individuals, can contribute $100 maybe, and someone can contribute multiple times that, these people tend to feel that politicians pay more attention to the latter rather than the former. And I think that is corrosive of the democratic system, and therefore something that over a period of time will weaken the confidence of people that the system of government is going to right imbalances. Whether it will or not, I don't know, but there's certainly a widespread perception of that among a large number of people.
Well, I would go a step further. Just, the notion at the core of Citizens United that money is speech doesn't weaken democracy. It fundamentally undermines democracy because it creates the concept that some people have more freedoms than other.
Or more influence.
If you have more other, that if you have more money, then you've got more freedom of speech than somebody who has less money, and that's inequitable. And I think, the corollary that goes with it that I was thinking of when Bob was talking is, when Bill Bradley was running for president a few years ago, one of the points that he made was that the purpose of our society is not just the creation of wealth. The purpose of our society is to enable people to have better lives by lots of different metrics. And if we judge our success purely on the basis of whether GDP is up or down or the stock market is up or down, we are going to make the wrong kind of policy decisions for society as a whole.
Well, you can see this in the middle. Let me just use one example. The Middle East was an area where there was a lot of growth. We tend to forget this now. But it was not inclusive growth. A lot of people did not enjoy the benefits of it. So one of the things that's very important about a thriving market economy is that a large number of people see the benefits of the growth that occurs and are able to participate in creating that growth. And that, I think, is troublesome when there are a large number of people see that a few are benefiting from growth and they're not. It does create problems, and we've seen this in the Middle East.
Because time is short, I'll just quickly to that.
Yeah. Among the many pungent things in this book, in addition to the goat and the dog, there's a lot else too. And one thing that...
By the way, I just want to point out there's a difference between pungent and odoriferous.
That David describes his own evolution, and he said, going from the 90s, when the era of easy globalization, he said we underestimated those dislocations associated with these processes. And I think that's part of the themes that you're writing about this book, is how to write those. And we do keep coming back to the word balance. I don't think that David is advocating that we adopt the mode of partly state-owned Chinese companies, but find a balance. And I think that, for readers, and that question asked in the back, you're kind of looking to Scandinavia as if we're going to rebalance, that's one mode of reasonable model.
I think there are lessons there. There are lessons in Singapore and the UAE and other places where they invest and they take a more competitive point of view. There are a whole host of things that we can learn from a lot of places, but I agree completely with your point. I think we have time for
Rob Shapiro.
Thank you. I just would like to suggest that there's a third element here. It's not just about the state and capitalism, but about culture. That when we describe the American corporations as not bearing social responsibility because it's not their function, that's a cultural statement. That's true in the United States. It's true for our culture. It's not true for lots of other cultures. Certainly hasn't been true for Japanese capitalism, and is not true in lots of parts of European capitalism as well. And
so you're referring to Tokyo Power and Light specifically? I'm sorry, Adam.
But what do you mean, Rob? I mean, what are they doing, those companies?
Well, for example, let me give you what I think is a really clear example of it. Corporations all over the world, executives in corporations all over the world, effectively have the ability to set their own compensation. The top executives. There are compensation committees that are appointed that come from boards of directors, most of whom are either appointed or accepted by the CEO. In the United States, the corporate culture says that it's acceptable for CEOs to compensate themselves at an average of 300 times the average today, the average worker. In Europe, the culture where they have the same power to do that, there's no legal constraint on them, and it's about 40 or 50 times. And so it's part of the culture that that's not acceptable behavior by corporate CEOs, and that more responsibility for helping workers manage the conflicts between home and work, for example, in Europe. Yes, there are laws, but those laws also come out of the same.
Can I ask you a question then? Let's stipulate that your trend analysis is correct, that gap is widened. It hasn't always been American culture. So it's really, if it's culture, it's a recent culture. It's not a traditional one. Why do you think it's become a more recent as opposed to a more traditional one? I'd be sort of curious as to what your analysis leads you to conclude about that. I mean, because that's an interesting question.
Maybe that's a
why
question for David.
Well, I mean, I think, look, it's increased 5, 6, 7 times over since the 70s, right? In the 70s, it was 30, 40, 50. CEO would make 30, 40 times more than the average employee now. Actually, it's 10 times over, because now they make over 300 times. I think part of it goes back to financialization and compensating people with options and, enabling them to take advantage of the climb of their shares. But I think another part of it, which is related to culture, has to do with how you think of a corporation in its role and how it's constituted. Because one of the things that Rob was, potentially referring to is that, in German corporations, labor is part of the board, and boards are much more separate from management. And you've got a structure that tends to therefore produce actions that are more responsive to the community, more responsive to the workers, and so forth.
Moreover, that didn't arise out of a war between business and labor. That arose more as an agreement of business.
That was how they rebuilt their economies after World War II.
Yes.
Have you seen the compensation levels in India, China, Brazil? I mean, these are more the American than the...
Well, I was going to say, just one last point. The Chinese model, it looks very attractive now, but when, over a period of time, this is a very recent model, and it remains to be seen whether this Chinese model of these large companies that get huge benefits from their governments are going to be able to sustain that in an environment where perhaps their governments are not going to be willing to provide large sums of money indefinitely. And other countries that want to compete with the Chinese model may find and that instinctively, while it looks good for them to have state capitalism, they're competing against a country with very deep pockets. So one of the things they may decide is that while we might think a state capitalism model is a good idea, if you're competing against a country with $3 trillion and you only have $100 billion in your reserves, trying to compete with the state subsidizing companies or export credits or electricity or a lot of other things may not be so attractive. So what works in one country may not work indefinitely there, and they may themselves want to make their model much more efficient and much more benchmarked to international standards. So,
I think it would be risky to sort of say one version of capitalism could triumph over the others. Right. I think where we're heading towards is a hybrid form of capitalism, and the thing for Americans that's kind of wrenching in all of that is that the role that we are going to play in determining what that hybrid is likely to be less than the role we played in determining what the hybrid was in the past. We can determine how much it is by how successful we are and how emulatable we are, but we are currently trending in a direction where you might see some others. I think in the context of Asian capitalism, the Chinese are looking for models within China and outside of China.
That's changing very dramatically.
Right. So, Singapore may be a model, or India may be. There are other kinds of models there. So this hybrid is evolving all the time.
The rivalry continues.
Do we have time for one more question? Yes. Well, the question is standing.
Just curious about the issue of what the economists would call regulatory capture. You haven't really talked too much about that. I would call it more regulatory manipulation. And if you look at whether it's in the financial area or in oil and gas or military industrial, Ed, I was just wondering what would Larry Summers' speech be like with the December 2000 deregulation of credit default swaps, which happened in the Clinton administration, and that led to a lot of mischief, as we well know. I wonder what the speech would be like. And then, Goldman was really pushing along with all the other financial companies for the deregulation of Glass-Steagall, which was also a bipartisan Clinton thing as well. So how do you balance regulatory manipulation as it relates to this? And if you look at the financial sector of fairness, the last 10 years, the financial sector has taken about 42% of profits. Before that, traditionally for decades and decades, been about 17%. Is that fair? But it has to do with regulatory capture, basically. I wonder if you might comment about that in the context of your overall discussion.
I wasn't quite sure of your question to me, but for the second half.
I was waving my finger just because I think we have a minute. That was a signal.
We have a minute, right.
So I'm going to defer to these gentlemen.
Mm-hmm. Regulatory capture.
I think Ed ought to answer this question. He's written a lot about this.
What would the speech have been like in 2000? Well, he did give several speeches opposing regulation of derivatives.
There's a footnote here that you guys need to know, which is who was Larry Summers' speechwriter then? Ed. No.
Hence the question.
I just wanted to clarify that.
No, I think one question right there. This gentleman's been very patient.
Please.
My name is Bill Root. I used to work for Bob Hormats in the State Department. Does not David Stockman and his crony Capitalism have a point? Or to put it starkly, are we not? Does not the present system have the seeds of its own destruction? And the next time the bubble bursts, we will have to let more than Lehman Brothers go, and we'll be back to a depression, and there will be the basis for fairness and security. I was old enough that I know I had a happy childhood in the Depression. It wasn't all that bad, but it certainly does not speak well for the future of American-style capitalism.
The doom loop, David, and do you want to wrap it up as well? Because I know that you're...
No, I think we have to wrap it up. I think the best possible way that we could wrap up a discussion like this is on that note that the depression which we see lurking may not turn out to be so bad for all of us. I'd like to end up on that optimistic note that it may not. Certainly, the system has the seeds of its own destruction in it, and certainly right now we are not addressing those seeds as aggressively as we should if we recognize them as the seeds of the destruction of the system. And so part of the point of the book is to say, look, let's stop, let's view things in a historical context, let's try to understand what are long-term trends rather than short-term trends, and let's try to understand what is setting this model back vis-a-vis the other models, and what are the gaps in the international system that we've got because so much evolution has taken place since the last major revision of our thinking about how that should operate, whether that was at the end of the Second World War or the Treaty of Westphalia, in the middle of the 17th century, I'm not sure. But sometime between those two, there was a revision, and we need another one. And so the point of the book is to trigger a discussion like this, and I think you've moderated that discussion very well. What I'd like to do, though, before we conclude finally, and thank everybody here, is to offer a few housekeeping notes that I have been given. One, if you go out this door and go downstairs, there's actually cocktails and food and stuff like that, courtesy of the Carnegie Endowment. Two, I want to thank the Carnegie Endowment, which has now been my home for doing the last 4 books that I've done, and has been a wonderful place to work on these kind of things, and is a fantastically convivial atmosphere, and has provided me with May Saba, who I see over there, and Chris Zoya, I don't see where he is, who have been the masterminds of the research behind this project and who have done a spectacular job. There are others in the crowd who have been helpful, some of whom have been cited, including my wife, who has been especially patient through all of this, and also my colleagues at Garton Rothkopf and elsewhere. But the final bit of housekeeping note that I've got, which is just your spectacular good fortune, is that thanks to an anonymous benefactor, downstairs you will find paid-for copies of this book for everybody who came. So if you go downstairs, you can have
not
food.
United America.
Huh?
Not United America.
Right. You can have food and alcohol and free books, and if you want, I'll even sign the book. Thank you very much.
That was a lot of fun.